for our afternoon. We had a great start. I'm really excited about how we're going to continue our day. And so our next moderator for this session is Tracy Isaacs. Tracy Isaacs is a professor in philosophy and in the Department of Women's Studies and Feminist Research. Tracy was also Tracy was also the very first chair of the Department of Women's Studies and Feminist Research. Women's Studies became a department in 2006, and so she took the helm at that time, and really...
I took the helm a year later, actually.
It was a year later.
Acting chair.
She was acting chair, okay. Almost got that right. But under Tracy's guidance, the department has really grown and flourished. So I'm going to now hand the floor over to Tracy Isaacs.
Thanks, Helen. It's so great to come to a women's studies event that I didn't have anything to do with it. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Joanne StLewis. Joanne StLewis is an assistant professor of law at the University of Ottawa, where her work examines the operation of social justice principles and legal culture. Her interests include African women, critiques of international trade, and art, culture, and the law. She's a lecturer in the University of Southern California Executive Program on Counterterrorism. Love to hear more about that. She's also the director of POWER, Africa Canada project, which focuses on equality rights issues facing African women and girls. Joanne is the first and only Black woman to be elected as a bencher of the Law Society of Upper Canada, a governing body for over 41,000 Ontario lawyers in its 214-year history. She was co-chair of the CBA Working Group on Racial Equality and author of the report Virtual Justice, Systemic Racism and the Canadian Legal Profession. She has held positions with the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Ontario Race Relations Directorate. She served as Executive Director of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, LEAF. She was also the Special Assistant Government Affairs to the Grand Chief of the Crees of Quebec. Joanne is the recipient of the 2012 National Hero Award from the Black Students Association of Canada, the United Nations Association of Canada 2009 Honored Champion Award for International Women's Day, the 2009 Canadian Association of Black Lawyers Celebrating Excellence Award. It's all from your own website.
I didn't know you were going to read it.
People need to know how awesome you are. The 2008 Dreamkeepers Life Achievement Award from the Martin Luther King Jr. Day Coalition, and the 2004 Ottawa Life Magazine Top 50 People in the Capital, and the 2001 Canadian Association of Black Lawyers Recognition of Black Women's Contribution to the Law Award. Wow. Today, she'll be speaking to us on radicalizing pedagogy for social change, speaking diversity to power.
It's one of those things, should I hang my hat now, like just bury myself behind this podium? I don't know. Thank you very much for the very generous introduction, and I do want to say how very grateful and thankful I am to be here and to share some thoughts with you today. I view every opportunity to speak as a moment for me to pause in the middle of what I'm doing and engage in a amount of reflection on where I am at that moment and whether I can find a way to configure what I know and what I've experienced into something that might be meaningful for others. So as much as it was a last-minute invitation, I also felt it was a timely opportunity. Reflection is always timely. The title came first. The content is evolving as I'm speaking to you now. The reason for the title and the intention behind the title, you'll probably notice that what I didn't do was list a sort of, how do I say, a reflection, a mirror of who I am and say, well, it's about race and it's about gender and it's about all these things. And that's because over time, I started at the University of Ottawa in 1989 as the founding director of its education equity program in the common law section. And I really do have a lot of discomfort with some of the diversity conversation and the way in which it lends itself to identity politics, because I'm thoroughly frustrated with the notion that I'm always and also something. And my own approach in my work and in what I do tends to address this as central to everything that I do. And you know what? You have to just cope with it. So in my case, to give you an example of what I mean, what I teach, amongst the courses I teach, of course I have seminars where you would see by the title of the seminar, obviously if it's African women, oh, if it's a black feminist thing, it makes sense. But I teach legislation and public law. I teach administrative law. Why do I teach those particular courses? I teach those courses because students don't get to self-select all the time away from those courses. I teach a first-year mandatory course because, heaven forbid, you have a black feminist in front of you who exercises the core concept of academic freedom to fill the course with whatever content she wants, and I'm wholly impervious to your suggestion that persons in another section are doing something else. I don't care. You know? And so when I say radicalizing pedagogy and speaking diversity to power, what I'm saying is, why is it that we are doing diversity? Beyond the simple issue of individual self-actualization for us as persons who wish to look at a particular area, does it have a different purpose? So I'm seeing this conversation that I'm having with you now as being a complement to the other things you're hearing over the day. What I'm suggesting is that it is more than about us or about me, Joanne StLewis, in a space. That there is a purpose to universities and a purpose to knowledge. And the issue is one of service to communities. It is a service to the broader public, and that broader public is diverse. It's not about us being diversity people trying to get by noblesse oblige a little spot to say something. It's about whether our educational institutions are actually competent to engage in knowledge creation and dissemination if we are not present and fully able to engage in pedagogical and curricular innovation. And I'm saying right now our universities are failing in that task, and they actually pat themselves on the back for the limited amount that they do. And I'm not willing to say thank you very much for very little. It's just not acceptable. So that's part of what I want to start with, low-key. I did mention to a couple of people who didn't know me that I'm notorious for this inability to find my own voice. I'm notorious for my inability to express myself clearly. So you are seeing my assertive training courses coming to the fore. I'm trying my best. I'm going to float between giving you direct statements out of my personal experience and then talking a bit conceptually. And why I say float between, because another area of concern for me is that sometimes the voice of the so-called outsider, and I'll be deconstructing that in a moment for you, is one of the narrative. So I have narrative and experience, I emote, you empathize, and I have no theory. And I'm very reluctant, as much as I appreciate the role of narrative in critical scholarship, to be relegated to that space to do my explanation of what I think is happening in the academy. Before I go any further, I would be remiss in not speaking directly to how important this event is and to the leadership that my colleague Constance Backhouse has had in my field, and I think more broadly in university education. As you know, Constance Backhouse is my colleague at the Common Law section at the University of Ottawa. If you look at the body of work that Connie has created, Constance Backhouse's work is its own testament to that issue of not being relegated into the narrow space of what we think legal academic work is. Right? It is about saying, well, I can be a historian, I can give voice, I do not have to simply speak to my own experience or work in terms of recapturing and putting forward the voice of persons of color, specifically women of color, in very detailed ways, amongst other areas are a demonstration of leadership. And I think doing it, particularly at a point when it was far from a common thing to do. So I think it's very important to understand that as much as I'm speaking about the entitlement to voice and place that I think that racialized scholars ought to have, that it is not one of saying that we are to territorialize the entire area of scholarship around issues that affect racialized communities. But it is problematic to always speak through the filter of others. It is problematic to be so few that what we say does not get to be diversified and nuanced because every single person, because of the embodiment of a vast multiverse of experience for racialized communities. Even simply reducing myself to a black person is still a multiverse of experience, whether I am first generation Canadian, as I happen to be, but I'm a first generation Canadian of Caribbean parents. Okay? That means that not every single African American scholar is of burning interest to me. Thank you. And I do not think that every African American scholar actually captures my experience accurately, nor do I wish to teach them, which my students learn very quickly. And I don't apologize for that. It's the constant need to apologize and explain myself against a set of normative values that I've not constructed that I think is part of the problem. So if we stop at diversity as being the photo opportunity to see a range of people who are different, it becomes a problem if those individuals, no matter how much their interior is radicalized, if they cannot express that difference, you have not accomplished diversity. But what you have done is done something very, very comforting for those in power. Because they point to that snapshot and they give that interesting award, often to themselves for their progress on diversity. They've never asked us whether we would give them an award. We're required to be very polite and very civil. The fact that that form of civility is an actual manifestation of our oppression is never discussed. Because obviously, if I'm not grateful, I'm obviously rude and uncivil and unprofessional, as opposed to the fact that I'm just naming your incompetence. And I think this is a problem. What I can tell you is as well that there is a tension that I have to disclose for me as someone in front of you, because we're talking about the Royal Society, and we're talking, many of you in this room already have the degrees I'm speaking about or aspire to or are in the midst of it. You need to understand that I have tenure at my university in a context where advanced degrees are required, and I don't have those degrees. So I am speaking to you as a person without a master's and without a doctorate in law, who teaches in law. One of the first things my students learn, should they have the temerity to suggest to me that this is a problem, is that I point out to them there's a difference between academic expertise and intellectual expertise. I'm absolutely certain I'm an intellectual, so if you, as I said to one student some years ago, wish to do trial by combat of ideas with me, your blood will be on this floor. So I say that because it speaks very much, and I want to pick up on some of what Frances said, and the challenges of her study. Frances and I had never met one-on-one until this meeting, and yet we know each other's work so well. I cannot emphasize how important I consider her work to be, and how truthful the content of what she's saying is. In my view, where I sit, the one thing that I have never had is privacy, because my politics has caused me to cede my privacy. So the very thing she described in her work as protecting the privacy and changing the stories is something that I made a choice early on that I could not do. Because if the people who came after me were to understand what I did, you needed to understand exactly the context in which it happened and why I made the choice that I made. Yet, I will tell you, the first time I did it, I cannot begin to express the level of internal resentment I had at a level that I had to do that. And I need to explain to you what I mean by context. When she says looking at statistics, for me, every survey that linked to its employment equity, we want to understand what's happening. She's describing a reality here we want to understand, but she said there's a difficulty about identification. Well, let me tell you who I am. Okay, so you're doing, back in 1989, you're doing a survey at the University of Ottawa to identify black people? Well, gee, for the longest while working at the University of Ottawa, I only knew of 2 other tenured black women. I don't mean in my department, I mean in the whole university. So how in heaven's name, if you were asking for other than identity, if you asked a single thing about my experience, were you not going to know it was me? Oh, let's do a study, flipping back, and let's look at just law schools. There are 21 law faculties. We could certainly hide Joanne amongst all of the black people in Canadian law schools. Given that a significant number of them have been hired in the last 10 years or so, let's just go back to 1990 or so, when I'm getting, I'm in my tenure track thing and I'm fighting the good fight. 21 law faculties, and we're in 2013, and we don't have 1 per school. Now, when you add that we don't have 1 per school, and you consider that some schools have yet to hire not their first black person, their first law professor of color, it tells you there's a little tiny problem. When you then say, let's go down to the black community, well, let's find the black women. Where am I hiding? I don't have a tree. I've got some sapling waving in the breeze with my big self behind it. It is really not anonymous. So the choice that I had to make was I going to disclose, articulate my experience, run the risk of the discomfort to my colleagues, which I did. And I've spoken in other contexts, and you can ask me questions in the question period about some of my experience. I've long ago breached my privacy. But I think it's a problem. It's a fundamental problem. I'm very aware that the manner in which I'm speaking to you is a combination of simply my personality, which is, as you can see, very direct. My politics, which actually has never privileged being in a university is that important to me, instead of my politics. And so every time I spoke, I was willing to take the risk that I would be excluded from the academy, because I felt I was going to be more damaged by the fundamental compromises of my voice. That is not a way that everybody makes a decision. It happens to be the way I make a decision. It is also true that what informs me at a theoretical level is not the same basket of individuals that you tend to refer to in this context. And then brings me to one of my comments that I want to make about what's the nature of radicalizing pedagogy. If we enter into the academy, what is it that we enter into as racialized persons? And I am focusing on that because as I said, I'm floating between my own experience and I'm not trying to speak for other communities and what their challenges are. The very process of engaging in higher level learning in the academy is dangerous. And I don't mean it in the sense of taboo and radical. I mean it's dangerous to the self and to actual creation of new innovative projects. And I think the sort of phrase I used to describe when I entered the Law Society, so when I became a bencher at the Law Society, imagine me going into a room and there are 80 persons, and none of them, there's one black male who was elected at the same time I was. And in fact, most of the 8 years that I was a bencher at the Law Society, I was alone as a black person in terms of being a bencher. Do you know what it's like to be in that space? All those people who are so powerful. All of them with an expectation. They know who you are. They know what you're going to say. Everything you say is somehow not lining up properly in one way or the other. Every behavior measured, every behavior thought about. And what I said at the 3rd time I ran for election, I believed that using the law and being in that space was like grasping an open blade. That the better I became at wielding the blade, the more damage I was potentially causing myself. And I see that as an issue with the academy, that the more you embrace Eurocentric knowledge as a person who's racialized, the more you have to prove mastery, rigor, and credentials against that. You are ceding something about the other sides of knowledge that if you are not careful, you cannot recapture because you become habituated to the process of the compromise. And that is a fundamental construction that is inherent to diversity that we never, if you want to talk about what I think is a taboo, it is what I have just said. That is the challenge. It is whether what is the academy and what is understood as knowledge is actually competent and comprehensive enough. We do not start there. We keep talking about whether we need our own journals and whether we need our own spaces. We never start from a position of saying, is the thing itself competent, correct, and proper? And all of a sudden, the person who's racialized comes in like a Don Quixote, tilting at this windmill in their madness and insanity, and if they're lucky, finding some other people who share their fantasy, sing along with them, and that's supposed to show that the system is changing, while the system is calcifying, while the system is not doing a blessed thing, but congratulating itself on the fact that it's not smoked you on the head with a mace instead. It's absolutely positively ridiculous, right? And I think we need to think about that. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm talking about the basket of ideas that we rely on even when we have diversity conversations. The way in which we construct what is difference entering the conversation. So I'll give you an example. And I want to see where this goes, because I'm going to juxtapose a couple of scholars, and I want to see where that takes us. So, bell hooks. How many in this room know bell hooks? Tons of people. How many of you know Paulo Freire? Far, far less. How many of you have used him in any of the scholarship you've done? Even less. Now, what I'm going to tell you, and this is an example of what happens in my classroom, is that with all due respect, and I admire bell hooks as a black woman, I'm going to tell you radical pedagogy is situated and anchored more firmly in Freire, a Brazilian scholar, than it is in bell hooks. The fact that bell hooks has managed to translate into a more popularized form his theory does not mean that that is the source. What it reveals is something interesting to me in the nature of even critical scholarship. That if you start peeling it back, a lot of the critical scholarship is still a weird, bizarre form of colonization. That until that third world scholar is embraced by, even with diversity, a North American scholar, we can't see or hear them. It doesn't matter how many decades long their work is, how well developed their field is, we replicate a different order of power. So while there is a conversation we've been having about diversity and where racialized scholarship sits, I am arguing here that part of the problem is that we still have a colonial moment at another deeper level taking place because of our functional amnesia of the true intellectual history of the ideas we use for social transformation. The scholarship that you are using is derivative of scholarship by third world people and academics and intellectuals who were not in the academy. They were living a reality where human blood was spilled for liberation. All of their ideas were in service of social transformation. So to have this kind of shift that says, well, you know, it's whether or not I get to teach in this way, and not actually say to our students that there is a direct relationship between innovation, lived reality, and risk in a broader sense, to me is a failure of a conversation. That in the academy we have an obligation not just to challenge whether we've got a white canon and all of those pieces, but to actually acknowledge the source of scholarship and ideas that is fundamentally meaningful, because that's our job. Dissemination of knowledge is also about the source of knowledge. It doesn't start with us, and whether the us is white or the source, or the us is the academy or the us is North America, it is still partial. It is still fundamentally partial. So let me give you another example. Edward Said. How many people in this room know Edward Said? CLR James. Very few. Okay? CLR James. Now, Edward Said you know because of his groundbreaking work, Orientalism, right? And you also know his work in 1993, thereabouts, Culture and Imperialism. Now keep in mind, the people I'm naming are people I teach, but you also hear who else I teach. So, why is CLR James so important? CLR James is a Trinidadian scholar, born in, before we get to the 1900s, I guess it's, just on the cusp. He died in 1989, so before Edward Said is writing what he's writing? Yes. He's a black man, born in the Caribbean, manages to find his way to England, the United States, be incarcerated on Ellis Island, even found himself to Montreal at one point. We're talking about the 30s, 40s, 50s. That's the peak of his work. Now, why would I put him in the same breath with Edward Said? Because I'm saying only once in my combing through Edward Said's work was I able to see him acknowledge CLR James. He may have done it elsewhere, but certainly he did not make it a seminal contribution to mention CLR James. Yet his work is not the same and original compared to CLR James. CLR did a number of things that are important. He wrote an interesting piece called Beyond the Boundary. At the time he wrote Beyond the Boundary is a work about cricket. It's about cricket. Now, what's interesting is it's autobiographical and him relating it to the sport. Any of you who know anything about cricket, beyond the fact that it's an incredibly boring game and people talk about wickets and various things, will know that the majority of people who are playing the sport were racialized, coming from the Caribbean and elsewhere. But there were certain positions. It took a long time before black people, and we talk about all of the third world is playing this sport, but it is highly racially stratified. If you read his Beyond the Boundary, what you see is it's an exposition about the nature of racism and the relationship of colonialism. He is doing that in 1938. Okay? He wrote The Black Jacobins, which looks at the Haitian Revolution. I don't understand how you can talk about contemporary understandings of what's happening in Haiti right now and the way in which they have had difficulties, a lot of it from external influence, in being able to govern themselves, when that is the first revolution, and freeing of black people. It is a work that actually speaks directly to the nature of the history of the black diaspora in the Western Hemisphere. We don't know it. He wrote, the book American Civilization is published in 1993, after his death. But the work contains his writings and a reflection of his preoccupation with America, which he saw as its own unique civilization. And a couple things in that book that I find fascinating. In the book is a chapter where he speaks about one of the failures of Americans, and he's talking about the United States in this context, is their failure to see equality for their women. That American society's profound sexism is a source of it. This is a black man writing from an experience well before many of the people we talk about in the contemporary context. His personal autobiography is interesting. You have to ask the question, you probably are, why don't we know about him? Well, I've left out a tiny little detail. CLR, not just that he was a black man, CLR was a Marxist. He was a Marxist who became a Trotskyite. Remember the McCarthy era. My view is critical scholarship in the United States is completely enfeebled by the McCarthy era. It became impossible for their critical pedagogy to evolve against a social construction that found anything that bore the taint of communism, Marxism. It shut down their academy in fundamental ways, and they're still working through that. It collapsed into the shallow kind of conversation we have about class, which doesn't even really project a complexity of what we mean by socioeconomics and other forms of impoverishment. It made, for decades, a very difficult space for conversation. So CLR, with all the work he did, was forbidden scholar. So his blackness, his maleness, his third world status, and then one other, as if he didn't bear enough labels, one other tiny thing. CLR was unusual at the time because CLR James was in a number of interracial relationships with white women. But who were these white women? Some of the most significant critical Marxist scholars of his day. He was a very unusual man. So his shaping of how he understood equality was across a racial boundary and a capacity to deal with extremely strong independent women in terms of the shaping of the politics, used to working collaboratively. And yet, we don't teach him. And if we don't teach him, then we can't even begin to unpack some of the other level of stereotyping, which presumes that, in many ways, black maleness comes with a heightened patriarchy beyond European society. Black men are less progressive. We have to struggle. The conversations become so deformed when we lack pieces of information that are fundamental that it is a problem. So we move forward a little bit and we say, what do we do with this exactly? I always had this interesting question. I always wondered why it was that we could grant higher degrees when people never cited any persons who were racialized, who were prominent in the field. And that could give you not just your PhD, you could get an award. And that in fact, diversity was dependent on who your supervisor was, which department you were in, and then maybe by the grace of God you were in a field that might permit you to say something somewhat different, but only providing you demonstrated the sufficient notions of excellence. I am not clear on why it would not be possible to produce an entire doctoral work that cited not a single white person. And the reason I say that is not just facetiously. If we have gone through any North American educational system, it means we have already internalized those white scholars. It means we are using those conceptual frameworks. So why is it to articulate it, I can't, for whatever reason, articulate critical pedagogy through Freire and bell hooks, should I wish to, and never cite Giroux? What is the magic of my having to name someone who's been lionized by one cultural community when the content, as far as I can tell, is the same, with the save for the fact that if I cite the racialized scholars, I get intersectionality. And so I've saved myself a lot of trouble because my conceptual framework is broader. I don't know, but that may be because I have failed to get a master's and a PhD, and so I'm not understanding exactly the rigor it takes to be able to do that, and I'm open to be corrected. Oh, I'm so not a nice child, but my mother loves me. Why do we need to engage in rethinking this process of diversity? And when I say rethinking, it is not to take away from all of the work we do simultaneously to create human rights offices and to think about hiring. I'm just saying we need to put this more centrally on the agenda of something that we talk about. I'm not even willing, I kind of get the notion that it's a taboo subject, except I don't think it's taboo. I think it's essential, it's fundamental, it speaks to what is it we wish the university to be? What is the academy, and in whose image is it to be built and sustained? To what extent are we going to continue to say we're building diversity initiatives to serve the so-called excluded, and we do not allow the excluded to tell you what it is that we actually need to be able to sustain? There's not a single initiative around diversity that actually says, for a change of pace, we're just going to take a combination of the persons who are excluded, put them in a room and say, what is it you want? And I mean very specifically why I'm saying that, because I don't know about you, but I can talk about my own life experience. I spent a tremendous amount of time navigating the comfort of majority people. And it's whether it's the majority people in my law faculty, whether I'm in a feminist setting and I happen to be one of the few or sometimes the only one, I'm continually having to measure the degree to which my words are going to cause offense. And my words are not causing offense because I happen to be saying something that is impolite. It is that I have learned to have an internal compass around the threshold beyond which somebody is not willing to hear what I have to say as a criticism. And I happen to function with a willingness, of course, to cause much more discomfort than other people, partially because I'm less self-censoring than other people. And what I mean by the latter point is a very important one, I think, around the nature of power, which is this. I think we live in such a space where we're continually navigating for space and voice that people preemptively do not push other people. I have found that often I'm even more welcomed and received in my criticisms than people would initially think. I've had, like anybody else, Frances' study is very clear. Everything she describes has happened to me, and I'm one of the earliest of some of the things, and she's heard some of my stuff. The study has, stuff. But That being said, what I can tell you is I live in a state of continual hope. So that means I engage in my work and I say what I'm saying because I have an expectation the Academy is capable of change. If I did not think it was capable of change, I would not waste my time. I have a limited amount of life hours on this earth, and I'm not going to waste them in futility. But it also means that I have less time to accommodate people's discomfort. So at the end of the day, you don't invite me to your house for dinner. I cook very well, you're going to miss out on my wonderful meals. That's also the quid pro quo that happens when you don't invite me. I don't need to invite you, okay? And you keep forgetting that. I mean, I think that's the part that's probably the difference that flows from inside me. I'm not measuring myself simply against whether I'm let in or not. And that has provided me with a certain measure of insulation, not from the experience, but from how I internalize and understand the experience. So a portion of me is able to see it and name it fully for the racist construct it is, but I will not give over the content of the experience to say it has now made me into a victim because somehow my power and dignity has been taken by your bad behavior. That is simply not an option. That is not how I'm raised by my family. That is not how I go about living. So, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I should check. How am I doing? Right?
You've got a few more minutes.
Good, okay. I'm just right at this. I wanted to come to one other area.
You've got like at least 10, 15.
Good. I'm glad. I always worry because you see, I get into flight in my class. I lecture for 3 hours and my students often have to do, I tell them do timeouts to get me to stop because once I'm in flight, I just keep going. But I also want to talk about, at a personal level, how do I translate this beyond the courses I choose to teach? What is it that I do with my own work to try to make this happen? And I think it is that for all the criticisms I have about the Academy, I'm extremely happy to be a university professor. I do not have a view that I should be in some other place. I see it as a route and a place from which I get to do a number of other things that are profoundly important to me. And so much of my work has always been outward looking. And so you'll notice I'm an assistant professor in part because my choice, because I have to accept that, my choice to not pursue the master's and the PhD is an intractable resistance to the culture itself that brings with it certain consequences. It's just that I don't actually feel that it matters. Like as I said, one person said, one of my colleagues, very supportive, said, Joanne, you know, it takes nothing, just flip some of those papers over. I said, why ever should I do that? I said, where I am and where I do my work, do you think anybody cares about whether someone's an assistant, associate, or full professor, as opposed to whether what they're saying is relevant? I live in that world, and I'm not really preoccupied with this much smaller, tinier, self-indulgent world. But that's a personal choice. I see the university as a place from which I'm a lawyer, I'm in a law faculty. So part of what's important to me is the opportunity from that place to disseminate and engage my work, often for people, if I was outside, that would have to find a way to pay me, but I'm already a university professor with a job. I can decide to either consult on something and get paid or give all my knowledge away and not get paid. I can make those choices, and that's part of the privilege of being in the Academy. So that is what I sought. I sought a place which is rarely available to someone racialized. Often the exigencies of day-to-day living make it almost impossible for racialized people to take what is intuitively, as organic intellectuals, an understanding of the nature of the inadequacies of the system they face, but to translate that into higher concepts, to actually integrate other concepts that are critical, and then turn that into some kind of strategic engagement. You're asking all of that from somebody who has to figure out how to feed their children on a meager salary because they've come over as someone foreign trained, they're driving a taxi, and the rest of the time they're doing another job. And we're really surprised when we say to ourselves, we need to rescue them. No, you don't. You need to actually deal with the fundamental inequalities of capitalism and the way in which the neo-colonial process is exploiting these people. That's the issue. They can figure out their own stuff. They don't need to be rescued by an academic piece of research. But what we can do is actually name their experience. That's the kind of work that Francis does. What we can do as collaborators in a social change project is work together to excavate how we would like to create pedagogical tools and curricular tools that actually engage and support their work. But at the end of the day, we cannot mistake ourselves for that on-the-ground political revolutionary. Even at the best, when people call me an activist, I see myself as a law professor who does activism as well. But I am not a substitute for the day-to-day person that's on the street. And I don't want people to have that comfort, because in fact there is a comfort. Despite everything that I'm doing in here, there's a comfort from the fully bilingual Joanne StLewis who can get dressed up in girl clothes, stand at a microphone and articulate with the vocabulary of power those things. There's a little frisson in some of the environments I go in where they say, we've invited Joanne StLewis, and I know what that means. Oh, you're so brave, she's funny, she's going to say stuff. You know, I have a whole part of my work that's for community and about trying to figure out what that means, but also to try to translate that to my students. I say to them early on in the year that law is maybe perhaps about what you think is happening in law school, but justice is made flesh by what we do, each and every one of us, not just in law school. Every person comes together to create the framework that becomes a just framework. And that means we cannot, even as we do the work, even in the classroom, a lot of my students end up doing outside work. I take them outside, even my first years. They get projects that take them immediately outside of the classroom, and they have to do things. But I've created all kinds of courses in a sort of hybrid way. I created a course on social justice in the documentary film. Not for students to watch documentaries and understand that, even though that's an important source of voice. 50% of their grade was making a documentary in a law school. And the first thing people said, oh, do you make documentaries? I said, no, I didn't get there that way. I got there because I was concerned that my students had no meaningful way of understanding how every single voice, even the voice of so-called an excavator of truth, is always partial. And I thought the only way for them to learn it is for them to attempt to control their own voice to give a message, and to realize how complex it was to work that message through when you had to be respectful to others. I thought it was the best way for them to understand the humility you need as a lawyer to your client and to be in service of your client, for them to have that amount of power, but to then have to speak to people in the community to make their films. I felt it was important for it to be at least 50% of their grade so they could see the value and the importance of it, and it would matter to them to do a good job. I've done other things outside, but within the academy. Yes, I'm a lawyer, but I also paint. I oil paint. And some years ago, at the initiative of a young woman who wasn't in my faculty, she was in communications doing her master's, came to speak to me and said we were looking at the way in which the image of women of color was constructed in works of art. So we're having this conversation, we're having a conversation as artists. I'm an amateur artist, she was doing way more artwork than I do. I mean, I squeeze it in between all the other things I'm doing. But at the end of the day, I said, let's do an art exhibit. I know nothing about how you do an art exhibit, but to me an art exhibit is just a modified conference around, it's conference organizing, right? How hard could it be? So I ended up doing this art exhibit called Corrective Lenses. And Corrective Lenses, there were 11 of us as women artists, and we all reinterpreted iconic works of art by white males. And we painted our own version to excavate, either to challenge the image itself, or to excavate what we saw as the underlying, sometimes exoticism, sometimes flat-out, full-on racism of the works. And then I thought, well, doing an art exhibit, we're going to exhibit this art, right? So we actually had it exhibited for 2 weeks in the university center at the university. So students, as they're milling about their meals, doing whatever, it was in the main university center as they're seeing this, and we had, labels that showed the original work and what we were trying to accomplish. And the final example I give you, just to have a sense of what I mean, so that you understand that I kind of take the politics into the practical. My project, looking at Africa, which I no longer, because of a whole range of other personal issues, cannot devote the time I would love to devote to it. But at its height, one of the things I realized is as much as I was doing the piece outside, which was the work directly, that was involving the DRC, and then I had come inside, so I had a course now that was African women and the law, that I had a gap. I was doing speaks, I was speaking to community, but I had a gap around the engagement of the immediate community on this understanding of Africa as a place of power, of imagination, of capacity. That in fact the accumulation of all of the images is of an Africa enfeebled, corrupted, desperately in need of external help. And at the very least, not an Africa that is beautiful. And so I created a course that was a companion to my project I called Reading Power. There's a reason my project was called the Power Project. Power stood for, in my mind, progress and opportunities for women's equality rights. And that's what the project meant to me. And so I called it Reading Power in caps. And I used African literature. And the course was in continuing education. I did it in addition to my teaching load. I would read my regular teaching load and because it was not acknowledged in that way, and I would go in the evenings and I would teach this course, and I had a group of members of the public who were doing it for their own development. And it was like having a book club with me, they said. And I made sure they gave tea and cookies and stuff for my people, which was wonderful. There was a tremendous amount of support at the content department at the university for it. And what I did was use literature because, as I was having the discussion with Kim last night, my undergraduate degree is in English Lit. I think there's an immediacy and a potency to literature and to art. Art generally, but literature specifically. That it allows you in a way that I think has more integrity to insert yourself in the space of the person who's distinct from who you are. And to live through the complexity of their experience of vulnerability in a way that I don't think any amount of reading case law or any amount of lecturing can do. And so I felt by having them read these works and then come into a space with me to talk about it, I could then transition from their own experience and understanding, and at the end of the day also provide them with some literacy around my issues of social justice, international law, neocolonialism and colonialism, and a whole range of other things for which we in the Academy have wonderful language. So I hope that I have provided you with some sort of reflection, or a little bit, made myself a little bit transparent to you. I did basically, as I said, treat it as a point of reflection to look back on what I've been doing and to share it against the theme as it was explained to me by Helen. So I've come in late in the day, but I do hope I'm providing something that's complementary to your expectations. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Joanne. Questions, comments? Raise your hand, Helen will come over with the mic.
Thank you so much. Can you just talk, you talked about, you came back again to issues of partial perspectives in art, in teaching, and your own experience in the academy. And is there something that draws that all together for you? Because my way into that is thinking about that as a philosopher in the context of a particular theory, as opposed to looking at it as sort of the collection that was so rich and diverse that you described. And so can you just talk about what that means to you a little bit?
I think for me, it's about much more fundamental concepts around the notion of individuality and group relations. And so it doesn't start in sort of an anchoring of a theoretical framework that we have. It's about using the site of who I am as a starting point to help me to understand what enables me to engage with the world around me. So at an individual level, I do have many of the aspirations that other people in the Academy have, which is to look at all kinds of different areas of knowledge in my fields, the legal individual academic in my specific subject area, and to be able to master those and then communicate those to my students. What I think the challenge is that there's a part of me very drawn to the notion that no one discipline, no matter how critically engaged, actually contains the answers that I desire in my work. And you're asking me about whether there's a theoretical frame. It's not so much a theoretical frame as a theoretical exercise I've been engaged in more recently. I want to say recently, over the last few years. So some of you may know E.O. Wilson's Consilience, right? Now consilience, it's one of those grand things that always, in a sense has a built-in failure to it, because E.O. Wilson is the cross between social sciences and biology. One of the things that brought him to prominence was his work on ants and the way in which ant relationships tell us something about human relations. So it tells you, I have a very broad level of interest, actually, in terms of what I read. So I came across consilience, and I was fascinated by his idea that there's an underlying sort of framework or way of thinking about ideas that should be able to cross those different disciplines, so that I should be able to traverse the space from biology back through to physics. And I should be able to move from the space of biology to social sciences and the humanities. Now, when I read this book, I found it wonderful, engaging, and again, full, because you're trying to do something so big, full of these gaps and holes. But what I set for myself was a plan. I decided to see if I could prove consilience in the work I did. That the best way for me to understand the meaning of this idea was to apply it to everything I did. That's what brought me to art. Because I felt that what happened in his humanities chapter was that I could see that he himself was an artist, understanding the nature of how you produce art. Because there's a difference from observing and consuming art and producing art. So that's what brought me to, I started to sculpt this about 8 years ago. I started sculpting, and then I moved from sculpting to painting. I decided I would see if I could do these things, and it turns out I do more, as my brother says, than stick people. And I'm capable of doing something with it. But the consequence of that engagement that you're asking me about is that it gave me an incredible respect for the people working in other disciplines who've taken those pieces that I've dabbled into another level. So the way in which that's why I keep talking about partiality. In the same way that we say there's a multiverse within each community, I actually think intellectually there is a multiverse, and we need a humility to understand that all of us come together to build these places of knowledge. And no matter how I try, it is simply for me to accept my limitation in that way. So that would be more, so it's less actually coming out of a critical race theory or a feminist theory. It's actually coming out of this experience base that I've been engaged in over the last few years.
Thank you so much for your talk. While you were speaking, I couldn't help but think of Mary Matsuda's work. Yes. And the concept of the traveling diva, where she's often asked to come and speak on diversity issues, to fill a gap, but never asked to stay. And so I was thinking about this in relation to the concept that so many scholars of color are asked to speak on particular issues, and Lee Miracle has said she's asked to give the same talk on Indigenous women over and over at every conference for the last 15 years. And so I was thinking that how important your work is in relation to your creative strategies. That it's not just the content of what we know, but attention to its processes that is fundamental to the concept of real transformative change. That it's not just that we need to speak differently in terms of content, but also, again, to try to transform the system of knowing. And so I was wondering, in relation to this really innovative work you're doing in the Faculty of Law, what are the student responses to this? These are students who are expecting traditional law, and they're getting art and filmmaking and...
You know what? It's what you expect in some ways. I'm one of those professors that no student is neutral on, okay? So either they absolutely love me. They love me, they would fall on their swords, they would be body shields for me against the entire system. And they're amazing that way, and they remain profoundly loyal years after they've left. And on the other hand, I am an affront. I have paid paying my hard-earned money to learn law. I don't know what is happening here, but this is not what I've contracted to receive. And that takes the form, and I think this is one of the pieces that I'm always careful about my own responses to the reality of inequality, because I've had an opportunity and a capacity to withstand certain kinds of things that I'm very, very clear that others would not. And it has nothing to do with just my status. I've always had, as I said, this ability to walk away from the university. But I've had petitions against me. I've had Facebook pages against me. I've had students in a classroom, like they won't hesitate to glom together. The difference in my response happens to be, and this is the tension I was describing between individual and collective experience, because my personal history is one of being alone. I actually have, over the years, developed strategies that are wholly dependent on only my energy to solve it, because there were no infrastructure. So I don't have a personal response that tends to say, is there a policy that addresses this? Does anybody else care? Because my life has been, if I can't fix this right now in this pace, it's going to come back and bite me in the you-know-where, and I need to nip it in the bud right here. I need to assert my personal power, and for me, my personal power is not about being the academic in the classroom. I happen to believe being a black woman is a very powerful space. I have a very different view of what my blackness represents for me. So when that's happening, the breath I take in the classroom is to remind myself I am a historical person. That my grandfather was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. That my father was in his 30s before Trinidad was independent of its colonizers. My father was a Marxist. My grandmother, who just died this past summer, was 103 years old. That meant my grandmother, the majority of her life was spent working on a plantation. There was a chunk of time she worked on a plantation. That is my family history. My notion of risk is very different. I am a couple generations from those people. What risk am I running that somebody doesn't like me, or some young whippersnapper who doesn't even have a degree yet doesn't care for what I'm saying? Possess yourself in patience, talk about it over coffee, but you're not doing it in my classroom. So, but that skill is tied to a particular politic, a particular way of understanding myself that has always empowered me. It didn't come with joining the academy, I had it before. And because I was like a terrarium with only myself, I've spent a lot of time reinforcing those parts of my being to enable me to transcend. So that's been so I have had the challenges. I've never denied that those are real. It's just that I am aware that I've developed a particular kind of personal strategy around it. And sometimes it does make me a mentor and a model for my students because of the choices I've made. And in other times it just terrorizes them to think that they might never have to become me. So, you know, that's the mix.
How refreshing your presentation was.
Thank you.
I'm happy to hear you say that you still have some hope for academia. I haven't heard much hope earlier today. If you were the goddess of feminism and the academy, what would you do to move us forward other than at this glacial way that we're moving forward now?
You know, interesting, right? Because it's an interesting question around which levers of power would I wish to have control over exclusively to make something happen. And I think at the end of the day, change is not about concept, it's about people. So the thing that I would need to control is who are those people. I would immediately accept that even if I have that power, I would have to work through other people. So the first thing I would probably want to do, really, I know it would frighten people, I'm a lawyer, I understand due process, but I would evacuate the entire senior administration of every university. And I would say that I would use a new filter, and some of those people would survive because I have a particular view of competence, which is not just about narrow fields of knowledge, but an ability to understand that the academy is there as a service of students, not as consumers, but as knowledge bearers and people who are going to create new knowledge, but that more importantly, we're in service of the community. And if you could tell me you're going to do that, then you get to stay. You get to stay as a senior administrator. You get to stay as a dean. So I think that would be one of the very first things that I would want to do. But at a more immediate and practical level, I think we need to be a little bit less risk averse in the way in which we're strategizing around diversity. I know that there's going to be an unevenness in our progress. So that there are certain people in settings that are way too vulnerable and it's simply not possible to do it. But some of us are in settings where we could be much more radical and move much more quickly, and part of why it's not happening is because we simply are not taking the chance. And I think of my own faculty as that example. I joined the faculty in 1989. It was already 40% women. Our law, that's unusual in any faculty, much less a law faculty, which is supposedly the site of a hierarchy of power. We are well over 50% women on our faculty. We are the most diverse, racially diverse faculty in the country. We have I was the founding director of the EPIC program. 3 years later, we were 25% racial minority because I was not interested in the bureaucratic processes of measuring. People called me and said, well, what are you doing? What is your analysis of employment equity? I said, I don't need to do that and apply to the education system. I looked around, there's no one here. I don't need to do a survey. I just simply need to start admitting them. The biggest thing that my faculty did was to first decide there was a problem and the problem required resources. The second thing that they did, which I think was really important, is they hired me and they were not risk averse with the things that I had to do and say. And the third thing was they did not fetter me. They supported me, they accepted there was going to be pushback, and they supported me when that pushback came. They did not make me accountable to the pushback. And so it enabled me, so you sometimes need a human being to push it, but that human being needs a particular kind of support. People, the fundamental value changes, not concept, comfort. See the issue of comfort and accept that radical change requires disruption. Disruption means discomfort, and suck it up. You know? So that would be Goddess for a day. I could do that in one day, very efficiently, with a couple of people helping me out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or comments?
I have a question. I've been watching you, Joanne, and right behind you we have the Royal Society of Canada Promote, Recognize, Advise. So how could these are three really powerful words, how could we take those words and think them through in terms of your program?
Well, I think what we also have to do is when you have, for example, persons like Constance Backhouse who enter into these spheres, what we have to do is really, really support them, right? We have to support them not just by the information they need to do the work, but we have to support and promote the work that they're doing in that sphere. We have to consider whether one of the ways to support is also to create not just this idea that there's this mechanism of young scholars, but literally, do we need to do the equivalent with these institutions like we do with politics and create shadow cabinets? Why not have a shadow Royal Society, which we actually properly demonstrate as academics that has the diversity of scholars that we would wish to recognize? Why not have shadow reports to some of the elements that they're doing and allow the persons who are now insiders into those entities to have the support for their voice that comes from us outside, even though we've created an environment that is a more comfortable environment for us to do it. So in other words, there is this relationship, and I think that was very much your presentation, where you talked about, for example, the historically black colleges, right, and their role. That there is a place for a space that is politically engaged that we can better control. But the key is to have that space, which is a nurturing space, also become a jumping off point for engagement. And that way, we can hold them a bit more accountable in that way. We're not going to immediately transform who they are, but what we can do is make it more publicly obvious who they are. And the more publicly obvious who they are, the more they have to make choices around who they wish to be once they're seen clearly. And I think that will shift them somewhat, because public shaming does work. I just can't help myself, eh?
Thank you very much, Joanne.